If you've been watching my videos, you've likely seen this device at least once or twice. This is the Deluge made by Synthstrom Audible in New Zealand. Now, I got it over half a year ago, and I figured now was a good time for a review, as there's going to be a price increase coming. So on February 1st, the price is going to rise from $8.99 to $9.99, and I think that prompts a couple of major questions. Do the build and functionality justify the price tag? What devices does it compete with? And finally, do I think you should get it? And as I address these questions, I want to make sure you know that I bought the Deluge, I wasn't given it or sponsored by Synthstrom. Also, this review will focus on the features of the Deluge that I use the most often. So I'm not going to be exploring every single feature, as I'm more interested in sharing my user experience than just giving a fully comprehensive spec sheet. And last thing before we get into it, this is my first time doing a review for a musical device. So if you've got any tips on ways I can improve in the future, please let me know. And I promise not to segue into talking about how the Casio MT-68 is actually the greatest piece of music gear ever created. Anyway, let's start the review with build quality. So the build is, for the most part, good. I've carried it around in a backpack and thrown it into the car a couple times, and it came out in one piece. Now, the pads and buttons, that sounded awful, aren't too spongy. The sound from the audio jacks is always nice and clean. Overall, the body, the wood sides, it all feels really nice and premium. My only gripe is with these encoder knobs. They don't really have as much resistance as I'd like, and I've had a couple of them actually fall off before. Reattaching them was easy enough, but it was still a bit of a bother. Anyway, let's talk about the sound. So the Deluge can handle sound in a couple different ways. It has its own synthesis engines, but it can also use samples, either repitching them to play them chromatically, or triggering them as a drum kit. I found that its subtractive synth engine, at least to my ears, is capable of some very nice sounds. It's also pretty easy to tweak, which is nice because I don't think the Deluge's presets really do a good job of showing what the Deluge is capable of. There's some nice sounds, but by and large, you'll do your best work with custom patches. Now, if you prefer to use samples, one nice feature of the Deluge is that you can use multi-sampling, essentially loading in multiple different samples at different pitches, to get a more consistent sound when you're playing something chromatically, kind of like what I've done with these Mellotron samples. And the filters, effects, envelopes, and LFO can all be applied to the samples as well. So that's sound. Let's talk functionality. The Deluge's most obvious feature, of course, is this grid, so it can be used for entering notes, arranging songs, muting tracks, changing the start and end point of samples, and modifying the parameters of different patches. Holding the shift button gives you access to the functions that are written beside the different pads on the case, which is pretty necessary as the very limited screen can't really give you enough information to easily work with all the features of the Deluge. That said, with so many buttons that have different dedicated features and shortcuts at your disposal, the workflow can actually get pretty effortless over time. I mean, just right here now, if I hit Shift and Synth, we've got a new synth set up. It's going to be a basic square wave patch. And already, I mean, if I want to start changing, say, the level of the oscillators and bring in a second oscillator, I've hit a couple buttons and I am there. If I wanted to add some notes, I can just tap them in on the grid. If I wanted to add another clip to this song, I just tap a blank spot. New clip, I can add some notes here too. I'm going to spare you having to listen to the random notes I just entered, but you get the idea. Along with the Deluge's own synth engines and samples, it can also sequence over MIDI and send CV from here and gate from here. Combined with the sequencer, it really does give the Deluge potential to act as the brains of a fully DAW-less studio. I've used it to interface with both this Digitone and a vocal modular pretty easily. The Deluge stores its projects, samples, and presets on its SD card and streams them from there. As far as something like polyphony, Synthstrom says it's only limited by the CPU. I've had a few dozen notes playing at once in a single project. The Deluge didn't burst into flames, didn't explode, so I'm willing to bet that it's going to be able to comfortably handle what most people are going to need to throw at it. So overall, I think the functionality and workflow of the Deluge are really excellent and pretty intuitive. The whole grid for entering notes is really easy to get used to, and since the shortcuts are all written onto the case, it's okay if you don't memorize them. I haven't. The battery life is also really solid. One thing I did have to adjust to is the lack of auto-saving. I don't know why, I just figured that it would save my projects automatically. Turns out it does not. I have lost a couple projects and patches that I was working on because I flipped it off without thinking of saving. So definitely not a deal breaker for me, but something that you might want to keep in mind. To wrap up our review, I wanted to talk about the Deluge's competition and whether or not I recommend it. So let's do that. So the Deluge's main competition would be Electron's Digitact and Digitone, Teenage Engineering's OP1, Akai's MPC devices, and of course, the Casio MT-68, which is the greatest piece of music gear ever created. I haven't used the MPC's OP1 or Digitact, so I can only speak off of the impressions I've gotten from other video creators, but the Deluge is generally a more fully featured groove box than the Digitone that I have, and the feature set seems to outpace other similarly priced devices, with one big exception, and it's the thing that should come up whenever you discuss a hardware device, and that's a computer. So my laptop costs less than the Deluge, but it can do everything the Deluge can and more. I can run a DAW, I can use software synths that sound just as good, if not better, than the Deluge's synth engine. I can process and edit samples with a greater deal of complexity. I can use my computer to control instruments over MIDI. I can pick up an adapter for it to send CV signals, and I can run an emulator and play Super Mario World. So why would someone get a Deluge or any hardware device instead of sticking with their software? The answer, at least from my point of view, is the experience of using a hardware device. Now, as you've seen, the Deluge has tons of buttons with simple shortcuts, knobs with dedicated function, and most importantly, wooden sides. For some folks, using a computer or DAW can feel antithetical to creativity, and as a quick aside, I mean that on a personal level and not in a general sense. People who work out of a DAW are not less creative than people who work with hardware, and what's truly important is to make music in the way that you enjoy and find fulfilling. And while having the Deluge didn't make me a better musician, there's definitely music I've made that I wouldn't have created without it. In case it isn't clear, I love the Deluge. I think it's an amazing piece of technology that offers a frankly incredible degree of sequencing and synthesis power in a package with a desktop footprint of about a 13-inch laptop. And of course, it has tons of colored lights, which are very lovely and entertaining to watch, but do I recommend getting one? Well, not exactly. Like I mentioned earlier, the Deluge is $899, going up to $999 on February 1st, and that's enough money that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that everyone should go out and get one. Which leads us to the question, who is it for? The Deluge seems targeted towards a person who wants to produce full tracks while working outside of their computer, and doesn't mind sacrificing the power of a full-on DAW. Now, if you're dead set on a hardware groove box, I'd recommend looking up videos by other YouTubers who own competing devices so you can get a feel for which one appeals to you the most. With that, I feel like we've really covered what I wanted to talk about. I want to thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you like the music featured in this video, you can find it on my Bandcamp page with a link in the description. So yeah. It's just too bad that every hardware and software synthesizer is actually outperformed by the Casio MT-68.